Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Reck. I am an attorney with the law firm of Jeff Anderson and Associates. We are a law firm that represents survivors of childhood sexual abuse throughout the country and here in the Diocese of Buffalo. With me today is Stacey Benson. She's an advocate and associate with our firm as well. We're here today really for three reasons. And this may be a little bit longer than the event we had last time, and it's our intention that it's going to be a little bit more informal. Feel free. We're going to save some time at the end if there are questions or inquiries either about the information disclosed or about the documents that are disclosed and the information that's up on the website. Feel free to ask any of us about that. There's some survivor advocates here as well who may have information to add at the end. Again, we're here really for three reasons today. Number one, to announce the release of Volume 2 of the report on clerical sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo. This is Volume 2, which follows up Volume 1, which was released by our office about a month ago, back on March 13th. The key differences between Volume 1 and Volume 2 we will lay out in more detail in a minute. Mostly it includes all 42 accused clerics and additional information about church hierarchy and the historical context for the decision makers responsible for the current crisis. Second, we're going to discuss and analyze the causes of this current crisis here in the diocese today. And third, we are going to stand with and on behalf of survivors and call upon the diocese to do the right thing, all of the right thing. And that's going to include releasing the identities and the whereabouts of credibly accused clerics, all credibly accused clerics. And we will use some real-world examples from priests of the Diocese of Buffalo. Most specifically, Father James Cotter. Portions of his file have been available and are available on our website and were obtained not by release of the diocese, but through litigation. And we will outline how and why these disclosures are important. And then we will also call upon the diocese to create a fully inclusive compensation program that does not exclude more survivors than it includes. First, as to the report, I shared with you that this is a product of publicly available information. It was originally released about a month ago, and at that time it included 13 clerics. And of those, 12 clerics. And of those 12 clerics, the assignment histories were compiled from publicly available information. Ms. Benson will talk about the protocol for how that's obtained in a bit. Since that report came out, the bishop disclosed that there were 42 clerics accused of sexual misconduct, and he identified the names of those individuals, which is of some use and is a result of the current press for accountability and transparency. But the reality is that those 42 are likely a drop in the bucket. We know that 42 is less than the 53 that then Monsignor Cunningham disclosed back in 2004. So there are certainly clerics who have been accused who have not been disclosed. In the report also is a chronology of diocesan hierarchy, church officials. And this goes back all the way to 1945. And included in it are the officials who are responsible for handling the allegations of child sexual abuse. Specifically, this includes the bishops, it includes the chancellors, and it includes the vicars general. These are the individuals who are tasked with handling these allegations and handling the pedophiles responsible for it. This report, again, it's free. It's available in print form. Obviously, it's available to the press in print form. It's also available on our website. It can be downloaded by anyone, any member of the public can have it for free off the website. If anybody wants a hard copy, all you have to do is call us. Our contact information is easily available, and we'll mail you a hard copy for free as well. Just to give a brief background on how this report is created and why it's important, and to some degree what the shortcomings are being an outside third party trying to recreate secret diocesan information, is Stacey Benson.
Thanks. So, in looking at the report that we put together, all of the information is compiled from public sources. The main source that we look to is the official Catholic directory. And the directory is sort of a telephone book of priests, and it provides a listing of all dioceses in the United States. It also provides an index of all of the priests working in the United States. And as you know, there's no priest sex offender registry that you can look to show who's offended and who's been convicted. And so it's largely been left to the media and to survivors and to their advocates to disclose this information to the public, when in reality the diocese has the same information. They're sitting on probably plenty more information that could be made public. So the official Catholic directory is something it's published annually by the Catholic Church. It's submitted to the IRS. It can and has been judicially noticed. And many of these histories, as you can see in some of them, for example, they'll have designations that say, for example, on duty outside the diocese, or absent on sick leave, or absent on leave. There's also, in a lot of these histories that we've compiled, for example, you have Father Bielkowski, for example. He had an allegation in 2011. Until today, present day, nobody knows where he was, unless it was the media or a survivor or an advocate that made public his whereabouts. Another example, Father Freeman. From 1990, Father Michael Freeman, from 1990 to 2010, that's 20 years, nobody knew where he was. The public didn't know, survivors didn't know, and it's very important for survivors to know where these priests are. We don't know where they're living, whether or not they're retired, whether or not they've been laicized. None of that information has been made public. And survivors want to know that. They want to know where these offenders are, whether or not they had access to children, whether or not they were able to move on and molest other kids. And we think it's vital, survivors think it's vital, that the public be aware of this. And the release of names has triggered a lot of additional questions, such as, are these priests still alive? Where are they? What safeguards are in place to protect children? What safeguards were in place to protect children? What are they doing to make sure they don't access children? We don't know any of this.
Thank you, Stacey. You know, the background on creation of a report like this is the fundamental question: why does this report exist? Why was it necessary for third parties to create this when this information is readily and easily available to church officials? It requires nothing other than transparency. Transparency that's necessary for both analysis of mistakes that have been made and transparency that's necessary for healing, because healing is only a possibility when accountability exists. And this accountability could be achieved simply by the disclosure of what was known and when it was known. So the causes of this current crisis in the Diocese of Buffalo fall squarely on church officials in the Diocese of Buffalo. And make no mistake, this is a crisis in the Diocese of Buffalo regarding child sexual abuse. Never before has there been a push for such transparency and such accountability. Never before have so many survivors been empowered to come forward and disclose that this happened, that this secret existed. Never before have so many survivors been able to say, me too, this happened to me. And that only works when it's safe and when the identity of those responsible is disclosed. So, historically, the documents that have been disclosed show that the Diocese of Buffalo conducted a pattern of allowing perpetrator priests access to children throughout Western New York. That exists. What is necessary and what requires focus today is the decision that the diocese has been faced with in recent months. We know what happened, some of it in the years past, but what has happened in recent months is particularly noteworthy. This diocese had a choice, and the officials had a choice of whether to do the right thing or not, whether to set aside the secrets of the past, whether to set aside the protection of reputations and disclose the truth. They had a choice whether to do the right thing, and they chose not to. The Diocese of Buffalo chose to do the wrong thing in recent months. They chose, instead of disclosure and transparency and honesty, to not disclose the identities of all credibly accused clerics. They chose to keep secret the identities of clerics who are deceased and only are alleged to have molested one child. They chose to keep secret the identities of clerics who molested children who happen to be members of religious organizations. And that merits a very close analysis because that presents a public safety hazard, and it presents a barrier for healing for those survivors who were affected. The Diocese of Buffalo has chosen the reputation of deceased priests who have been accused of child sex abuse over the healing of the survivors of that trauma. Point blank, that's wrong. It prevents healing, and it has to stop in order for there to be a brighter future. Any organization, any institutional organization that has a culture that would allow the reputation of deceased accused a higher status and greater respect than the healing of children who were hurt is incapable of protecting children. Children of yesterday, incapable of protecting the children of today, and incapable of protecting the children of tomorrow until that culture changes and the welfare of children is placed first. So we wish that the right thing had happened, but it hasn't. So we stand with survivors and we call upon church officials to now do the right thing. And by doing the right thing, we mean disclose the identities and the whereabouts of all credibly accused clerics. Those who are alive, those who are dead, those who are diocesan, those who are members of religious orders. The survivors deserve nothing less. The public deserves nothing less. With the release of those identities, the diocese could and should release full assignment histories so that we know which communities were affected, which children were exposed to these perpetrators, so that outreach can be conducted to those children who may now be adults still suffering in silence, so that they know they are not alone, this was not their fault, and there is help available to get better. Until we know which communities were affected, they continue to suffer in silence. The diocese needs to make an affirmative choice that the welfare of these survivors is more important than the reputations of not only the abusive priests, but those priests who covered it up, and those priests that knew. And this means diocesan officials in the hierarchy that exist and that were named in that chart that I just showed you, the bishops, the chancellors, the vicar generals, the people responsible for handling these allegations and these abusive priests in the past. Their reputations and their histories do not trump the need for healing of today's survivors. Along with that disclosure comes the existence of what the diocese has termed the IRCP. The IRCP stands for Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Plan. It is a third-party administered compensation fund designed to compensate some survivors of clerical sexual abuse. The problem exists that this program created by the diocese really excludes more survivors than it includes. It's modeled after some of the downstate dioceses who created similar programs that were opened up to all survivors of clerical sexual abuse. Obviously, there are some issues still downstate regarding religious order priests, but at bare minimum, all survivors who were abused by diocesan clerics have been included in these programs. The Diocese of Buffalo has stopped short. The Diocese of Buffalo has only acknowledged survivors who already disclosed their abuse. Just those who were the bravest of the brave are eligible for the programs that are in place. And with the current crisis, we see tremendous numbers of survivors now empowered to speak, but barriers exist. And Stacey's going to talk a little bit about that as well, about those barriers, because we are, along with other advocates, and I would assume the diocese and local law enforcement are now being inundated with survivors who are speaking and need a warm and empowering response.
So Mike covered a lot of it, but in working with hundreds of survivors through these programs, one of the most important things for a survivor, if not the most important thing, is that moment when they come forward, when they share what happened to them. And they've experienced, as Bishop Malone even said himself on his video a couple weeks ago, a catastrophic breach of trust. That breach of trust is something that survivors live with. They live with every single day. And to pick up the phone and call an institution that has already betrayed them is something that many survivors will not do. Before that March 1st deadline, a lot of survivors had nowhere to go. They had nowhere to call. They didn't know what to do. The bishop has even come out and encouraged survivors to come forward. But what he doesn't say is that only certain survivors can come forward. Only if you reported that abuse can you come forward. So what about everybody else? Hasn't everybody else waited just as long as those survivors that have come forward? If not longer, shouldn't they be afforded the same opportunity that somebody who was previously reported be afforded? We think so, and there are plenty of survivors out there that we've talked to since this program was announced that feel the same way. But they also feel that they're not being treated fairly. What's the difference? What's the difference because there's a different designation behind that priest's name, or just because, he was still granted permission to work in this diocese, he was still here working in this diocese and allowed access to kids. So why is that different than a diocesan priest? The Diocese of Buffalo has an opportunity to do this right. They should include all survivors of all kinds of clerics. And if they have this opportunity to do it, and they should take that opportunity. It's an important piece of the healing process for survivors. And we encourage the diocese to do this because right now their plan is it's a gray area because we don't know what is going to happen next, if those survivors will be afforded some semblance of justice through this program.
So, in recent times, the diocese has expressed that there's some difficulty in somehow providing this information to the public, that there is some other burden that is insurmountable for them to provide complete transparency and complete accountability. The reality is there is no burden, there is no barrier. The assignment histories, the whereabouts for all clerics, not just the 42 that they've publicized, but all clerics who have been accused, exists. It exists in diocesan files. They've chosen not to release these files. So we've chosen to make an example as to how it can be released. For example, Father James Cotter His photo is up here. Father Cotter was a priest of the Diocese of Buffalo. He was ordained in 1950. He worked in the Diocese of Buffalo his entire career. He was a priest of the diocese. He worked at multiple assignments until 1978. In 1978, Father Cotter, for reasons which have never been disclosed, retired, cited medical reasons for a need to move to California. When he arrived in California, he carried with him a letter from the bishop here in Buffalo, and he was allowed to continue practicing as a priest in San Diego, California. Well, San Diego, California is one of the cities that was subject to litigation, one of the dioceses that was subject to litigation during a legislative window out in California, a window similar to what has been proposed in Albany for several sessions here. And as a course of that litigation, his file was produced to the attorneys who were working on the cases. And that file now exists, independent from the files that are still secret. And we gave you a copy of the entire file is available. It's on the website. You guys can download it if you want to. We brought with us and gave to you today just a couple examples from his file. The first page is the assignment history from his file here in the Diocese of Buffalo. It's one page that identifies where he was and when he was there. They could and should disclose this information. Later on in the file, page 3 in the packets that we gave you, there's a 2003 letter from the Diocese of San Diego to a survivor of abuse by Father Cotter, acknowledging the allegation. In 2003, the Diocese of San Diego knew he was an abuser. The Diocese of Buffalo certainly could have and should have disclosed that information much, much earlier than it did. And this is no different than any file of any priest that we've seen throughout the country. They all have this information available. It's at their fingertips. It could and should be disclosed. Following on that thread of accountability and the necessary transparency, when you go into the report, and just again so you guys can see it again, we have a chart of the hierarchy that identifies the bishops, the vicars general, and the chancellors. One of those individuals is then Monsignor Cunningham. Monsignor Cunningham now has gone on and is a bishop. Before he left Buffalo, he wrote a letter to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice when the bishops of the United States were conducting a survey. And he disclosed that 53 clerics were accused of abuse back in 2004. Well, I think judging by the current crisis, it's safe to say that number has not gone down and that number has not been accounted for by the diocese. Particularly troubling are recent comments by Buffalo church officials. And these comments disclosed that the Diocese of Buffalo has a category for its priests. And this category is titled unassignable priests. And those unassignable priests are supervised by an auxiliary bishop here in the diocese. They're not allowed to be assigned, and they meet periodically, and they're subject to some type of supervision and protocol. We have no idea what that supervision or protocol is. We have no idea who these individuals are. We have no idea where they are housed or what protocols are in place to prevent them from accessing children if that is the reason they are, in fact, unassignable priests. This presents a potential public safety nightmare and could and should be disclosed to the public. This is all information that's easily available. The survivors deserve nothing less and should have nothing less. Like I said, the documents are here. If anybody wants those, you're more than welcome to take them. If there's any questions, we're happy to answer those. We're streaming this event live. So we may have some stuff, some questions coming in from Facebook, so Stacey may check and see if there's any questions there. Also present, if she wants to say something on behalf of survivors, Judith, representative from a local survivors organization, may want to speak. Hi, Judith. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Judith Burn-Quinn, and I've been doing Survivors Network since 1996. So I have heard from many victims over the years. Right now, I have never, I mean, my phone was just ringing all the time. We need a place for all Catholics to help the survivors that are reliving this, that are very angry with the diocese, and they have no place to go. I don't think they should be going to the bishop or going to 795 Main Street. We need a trauma center, whether the universities or the colleges around here have people qualified to help victims right now. And they're survivors of priest abuse, but they are victims of this system that is not helping them and not helping them right now. So that's...
Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome.
To any of the survivors who are out there, it's important that they know you are not alone. You didn't do anything wrong. This was not your fault, and there is accountability and there is healing that's available. Thank you. If anybody has anything that, any questions or any thoughts, we're happy to stick around for a little while.
Mr. Reck?
Yes, sir.
My name is Bill Giambini. I'm with the Niagara Gazette. Can you speak at all to what the process would be if someone files a claim with the Victims' Compensation Program and there is a look-back window that's initiated or an increase in the statute of limitations for Child Victims Act?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. So, the question raises an issue of if someone participates in the compensation program, which is voluntary, it's 100% confidential, it's voluntary, it's outside of the court system, so it's very survivor-centric. Now, the problem with it, or one of the criticisms of it, is that it's only available to survivors who may have already reported. And one of the other items that one needs to be very aware of is that if you go through the program, and if you accept a settlement offer, and they will be making and are making settlement offers, if you accept that settlement offer, that survivor will give up future rights should the statute of limitation change. Now, in current New York law, the statute of limitations is one of the most draconian and one of the strictest rules anywhere in the country. But should that change in the future, participation in the program is a bit of a trade-off because it's some measure of justice available today, but obviously the survivor would forego rights in the future. So it's an important decision.
Could you define specifically what you mean when you say you want the diocese to release information about credible accusations? What defines credible?
Sure. So that's a diocesan definition. So there are protocols put in place by the bishops of the United States of America, put in place and defined, most recently in 2002. All of the bishops got together at a conference in Texas, and they created a protocol that defines and sets forth how these allegations should be handled and how the investigation should be conducted and what should happen to the clerics during the process of the investigation, and if the allegations are found credible, how they should be removed, and then the bishop has authority whether to seek laicization, removing them from the lay state, removing them to the lay state, defrocking them. So that is a term that they define. In basic terms, it just means whether the allegations can be substantiated. And that's they make that determination internally, and they never tell us how they do that.
So they don't tell you any sort of quantity in terms of 3 accusers coming forward of this person. That doesn't necessarily define it according to them, based on your understanding of it?
Yeah, my understanding is they have created that as a protocol, and why each diocese, and particularly the diocese here in Buffalo, makes certain determinations, you'd have to ask them. For example, they disclosed the list of 42 while they were under pressure by survivors and advocates to do so. Well, not included on the list of 42 are deceased priests with only one allegation. Why that was somehow chosen, I have no idea. I mean, that presents a barrier for the other survivors of those priests because those names are not released. That answer the question? I tried? Okay.
How many complaints are you getting of priests who are part of orders that are not on this list? We know that order priests are not on there, but how many?
I don't know that I could give you an exact number. I can tell you that it's a significant percentage, because traditionally when you look at a diocese like Buffalo, there are religious order priests who operate in the diocese. They come in from various religious orders, Franciscans, Benedictines, Jesuits certainly had a presence. And we have received those calls, and those are survivors who are left out of the compensation plan. They're left out of any protocol because they've seen what is happening. They see the crisis. They're able to now disclose, but when they come forward, the diocese fails to empower them, fails to even include them in their program because of a designation behind a different priest's name. So I couldn't tell you the exact numbers, and certainly we don't speak to every survivor, but I can tell you it's a significant percentage.
And I think, can I add to
Yeah,
that
please.
too? I think it's important to note too that there's not a focus on those religious orders. They're not coming forward and offering this same program to survivors. And, to differentiate, yeah, the diocese does that, well then there should be a focus on them as well. I mean, where's the justice for the survivors that can't get it through the diocese? So that's a common question we get from people too, and we don't have an answer.
The answer is that burden shouldn't be placed on survivors, because if you were a child and you don't have any control over who the priest is at your local parish, be it a diocesan priest or be it a priest staffed by an outside religious order, the only one who controls what priests come into the diocese is the bishop. And the bishop makes that decision. The bishop extends what's called faculties to a priest and allows them to minister in the diocese. The child didn't get to make a choice whether that priest has faculties. The parents didn't get to make a choice whether that priest has faculties. The bishop did. And so the burden being placed anywhere other than church hierarchy is fundamentally flawed.
Are you saying that Buffalo has put more conditions basically on all of this stuff than the other dioceses you've seen? That one allegation of the priest, more than one allegation of the priest is dead and can't be from a religious order. Is that common in other places, or are they putting more conditions on this program than the other places?
It's a really good question, Charlie, and the answer is yes. This program in the Diocese of Buffalo is far more restrictive than similar compensation programs that have been done by other dioceses in the state of New York. The current program, in reality, excludes more survivors than it includes. It excludes religious order clerics, and it's unclear how they're treating survivors who are now coming forward, and it's unclear how it's going to treat the survivors who, as Stacey said, are still suffering in silence. We don't know, and it's riddled with barriers.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you've seen the way other places have done it. What's the motive in your mind?
You'd have to ask the diocese, and other people may have opinions on it. I can tell you that in our experience, representing survivors, throughout the state of New York, I view it as a cultural problem with the institution. An institution that would choose to value reputations of church officials who conducted the cover-up in years past, and an institution whose culture would value the reputation of dead priests accused of abuse, creates the problem. And until that paradigm shifts, they're not capable of doing the right thing. They're on the cusp of doing it right now, and they could and should. But that would be my take. Others may view differently, and ultimately that's a question you should pose to the diocese.
Are the survivors interested, that you're hearing from, are they more interested in the compensation or trying to get healing, whatever abuse they suffered? It's more about trying to get help.
I would say the latter, definitely. In most people, what they want is an acknowledgement. They want validation. This happened. We're sorry that it happened. And they want to hear that. They want to hear it from a place that, was very important to them growing up as kids. I mean, they they revered priests, and the church was often to their families a huge part of their life. And to have that validation is, I mean, going through all of this and talking with survivors, when we're able to give that to them, even though it's through, you know, sometimes the bishop isn't always the one that does it, it's us relaying that, that is what, they don't care how many zeros are behind a number. They care about hearing their, and being validated for coming forward. That's what's important to them.
So when the bishop has said repeatedly, I'm sorry, does that fall on deaf ears with them or not?
It's a half apology, because an apology without true acknowledgement and transparency is not a full apology. An apology without acknowledging who the abusers are, without acknowledging what the mistakes were and who made them, isn't a full apology.
What would it do for these church communities to have some of that missing information be put public and to be able to sort of connect some of those dots as to where some of these people were at times when priests were serving in those parishes?
Well, at bare minimum, it allows the survivors who were affected and exposed to these perpetrators to know that they are not alone, that they are not the only people who were exposed to these, and that if they're still suffering in silence, they know that other kids got hurt too. So it wasn't just them, and that allows the shame and the secrecy to go away, which then allows them to heal. And going forward, that kind of transparency for the protection of children is just necessary for any organization that's going to be entrusted with children.
You know, a lot of Catholics that we speak with, maybe who weren't abused, their heart breaks for the victims, but they're infuriated more with the cover-up than anything, and there hasn't been a single word from the diocese about that. You have Erie Diocese, which named one of its own bishops last week as part of a cover-up. Do you see a gap here, and is it possible for a map like that to exist without someone at the top levels sort of engineering that?
I think the short answer, Charlie, is a gap exists between the reality of the abuse that happened and the accountability that has been provided. You know, this map right here shows a pretty even disbursement of perpetrators just from publicly available information. And we know that they utilize what's been referred to as the geographic solution. Files that have been disclosed are replete with examples of a perpetrator abusing in one location and then either being pulled out and moved to another location, or being pulled out, sent to some type of a church-owned treatment facility that have been mentioned before, like South Down, like Servants of the Paraclete, like the facility down in Silver Springs, Maryland, and then reassigned to a different location. So, you know, if the question is, does this happen without diocesan officials making it happen? No, of course not. They protected abusers when they should have been protecting children.
And they're going to other states and out of the country. I mean, this map expanded from a month ago to include all these other locations. I mean, we could blow it up the size of behind us and have a global map. I mean, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a good point that some of the most telling pieces of information about the history of clerical sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo came when clerics left the Diocese of Buffalo. For example, Father Cotter, who went to California. For example, I think it's Father Spielman, who I think was in Hawaii and subject to litigation out there. Those are the examples of how the information can come out. And it comes out when these priests move and when they move away from the Diocese of Buffalo.
You mentioned Monsignor Cunningham by name. Why is what he said or his involvement significant in that?
Well, Monsignor Cunningham was one of the, in our opinion, one of the most knowledgeable people regarding clerical sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo. He was a church official here, and he went on to become bishop of another diocese. Stacey, do you have the years he was here?
1975. He, based on our research, he arrives in the Diocese of Buffalo as the assistant chancellor. When he leaves in 2004, he's the vicar general. And so that's almost 30 years spent here in the diocese. to have somebody with that intimate knowledge of what happened inside the diocese with these abuse cases, he's the one.
When you refer to the 2003-2004 letter written by then Monsignor Cunningham, you mentioned the 53 number.
Sure.
Is that just a number, or were there identities attached to that figure?
Sure. It's a good question, Phil. So the background on that is the bishops in the entire country commissioned a study to be conducted by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, down in New York City. And every diocese in the country received a form from the college that was essentially a fill-in-the-blank form. Tell us how many perpetrators you have, tell us where they are, tell us how old they are, things of that nature. And that information was then, it was written down and captured in each diocese, and then it was transmitted to the John Jay College. To our knowledge, identities were not included in the information sent to the John Jay College, only numbers and statistics for their analysis. The identity of those 53 rests with then Monsignor Cunningham and the bishop at the time.
Is there academic privacy guidelines that prohibit John Jay from releasing any of that information or giving others access to the information that they may have?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the bishops own that information.
So would it, I mean, to your knowledge, is it within the archives of the college in some respect, or was it transmitted back to the diocese where it came from after the studies were conducted?
Well, the statistical outcome of the studies was published. So they created a report, and then the bishops actually released that report. So if you went back to that time period, you could find that actual report that had the numbers diocese by diocese, but the raw data and the allegations and the identities, those exist with each individual diocese.